The bank statement was a single sheet of paper, but for David, it was an obituary for 30 years of hard work. The balance read 0.00, and as he sat in his dim kitchen, the silence of the house felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. He had spent decades working double shifts and skipping vacations to ensure his son, Michael, would never know the sting of poverty. He had handed over the keys to his future, trusting that his blood would be his greatest legacy. But trust, he soon learned, is the most expensive mistake a man can make. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. David had raised Michael to be the man he never got to be, an architect with a bright future and a heart that David assumed matched his own. The red flags were there, hidden in plain sight, like the expensive suits Michael wore that he couldn't possibly afford, or the vague stories about a new fiancée named Sarah who supposedly worked in high-end finance. David had brushed off his own intuition, blaming his growing unease on the generational gap between them. He watched his son move through life with a charm that seemed polished, almost rehearsed, never suspecting that the man sitting at his dining room table was systematically dismantling the foundation of his father's life. Every time David looked at Michael, he saw a mirror of his own pride, but he was actually looking at a stranger who viewed his father not as a parent, but as a resource to be harvested. The betrayal was not an impulsive act of greed, but a surgical operation that took months to complete. Michael had spent weeks slowly gaining access to David's private accounts under the guise of helping him manage his retirement investments. He had spent hours sitting with his father, patiently explaining the complexities of modern banking, all while quietly shifting funds and forging documents that gave him full control over the family home and the car. By the time David realized what was happening, the legal machinery had already turned. The house had been signed over, the car had been sold to a private collector, and the savings accounts were drained to fund a life that David was never invited to witness. The wedding was merely a facade, a distraction to ensure David remained preoccupied with paternal joy while his son stripped him of his dignity. When David finally received the notification of eviction, he felt a cold numbness settle into his bones that he hadn't known since his youth. He reached out to Michael, hoping for some explanation or a sign that this was a cruel misunderstanding, but the phone went straight to voicemail every single time. He showed up at the address provided in the wedding invitations only to find an empty rented hall and a group of confused guests who had been ghosted by the groom. The truth began to crystallize in the air. Sarah was not a finance professional, but an accomplice who had been feeding Michael's delusions of grandeur. They had burned through the cash in record time, living in high-end hotels and luxury suites while David's world was being foreclosed upon by the very man he had taught to walk. The investigation that followed was a slow, agonizing process that forced David to confront the reality that his son had committed a series of crimes that the law viewed as a civil dispute. He spent his days in drafty offices and his nights in a cheap motel, clutching a folder of stolen signatures and fake notary stamps. He looked at old photos of Michael playing baseball, the same boy who now stood before a judge with a cold, hollow expression. The legal system required proof of intent, and David had to argue that his own flesh and blood had acted with malice. As the case unfolded, he discovered that Michael had been living a double life for years, accumulating debt and burning bridges long before the house was ever sold. The betrayal was not a singular event, but a lifetime of small lies that had finally culminated in a total collapse. As the months passed, the public eye turned toward the courtroom, where the story of the stolen life became a local sensation. David sat in the front row, watching his son whisper to a public defender, never once meeting his father's eyes. The prosecution laid out the timeline of the bank transfers, the fraudulent power of attorney, and the calculated liquidation of assets, each piece of evidence another nail in the coffin of their relationship. The witnesses described Michael as a man possessed by an obsessive need for status, a man who saw his father's life as a prize to be won. For the men in the gallery, most of whom had spent their lives sacrificing for their own families, the sight of David's hollowed-out face was a mirror of their own deepest fears. The trial revealed that the money hadn't just been stolen, it had been incinerated in a desperate attempt to buy a life that Michael couldn't afford to maintain. In the end, the verdict was clear. but the relief was nowhere to be found. Michael was sentenced to prison, a small justice that did nothing to restore the years David had lost or the home that had been sold to a stranger. As David stood on the steps of the courthouse, the wind biting through his thin coat, he realized that the legal battle was over, but the wreckage remained. He had won the case, yet he had lost the purpose that had driven him for 3 decades. He had become an expert in the fragility of legacy, understanding now that the walls we build to protect our children are the same walls they can use to trap us if we are not careful. He walked away from the courthouse alone, carrying only a small bag of personal items and the heavy, lingering question of whether he had ever truly known the person he called his son.